Now they're messing with her family. They had a great relationship even though they worked together all the time.
It was lie after lie.
He has the traits of a sociopath.
He's certainly a monster.
And one of those is the narcissistic personality.
I just fell to the floor because I knew that something had happened.
It was a horrific scene, one that I'll never forget.
Tammy was born in Pennsylvania. She was a happy kid. Very energetic, rambunctious, had her own way to do things.
Yeah, where we lived, I mean, we had animals, cows, pigs, chickens, turkeys, stuff like that. Big old garden. Very nice up there.
Growing up, we did a lot together. We shared a bedroom. We walked a mile to school every day to the bus stop, and we were always together in that way. And we didn't have electronics back then, so we had to interact with each other, and we didn't have TV either.
And the winter times are what stuck out to me the most, you know, 'cause always doing something out there, sleigh riding. We had a big old dog that pulled a big old Saint Bernard. You know, she would pull us around, you know, build snow forts out in the front yard there, and just, you know, Christmas times would have been our favorite time up there for me. And we were around a lot of family. We had a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins, so pretty good life up there.
We moved to Virginia, our family. Tammy was very extroverted, made tons of friends. I had two. She just was very, very friendly, loved to run and have fun and run around and do what city kids do. Tammy got married, I think it was October 6, 1989.
I helped her get her dress and helped her get ready and went to her wedding. She was very young, she was only 16.
And they had 3 children. She had her first child previous to that. She loved her kids. Tammy loved being a mom to her children.
Well, they were good kids, happy. I mean, they couldn't wait to see us. I mean, it was always a good time when we got together, you know. I loved being around them. They loved being around us, so it was a pretty special time, especially at Christmas time, because, you know, she always made sure they had a great Christmas. You know, always had a lot of stuff. But I'm sure things weren't always that good behind closed doors when we're not around. It just got tough. I mean, I believe she was with the wrong person.
She was young and she had a rough start. She tried and she always put her kids first, but she did struggle, especially as a young single mother. She couldn't take care of all 4 of them.
You know, she knew if she needed me, I would, you know, less than an hour away from her.
Cassie came to live with me in Arizona. She lived with me for 1.5 years. That was when I really got to know her.
Tammy called me and she said, "Mommy," she said, "I need help." And I said, "Okay." I said, "There's a plane ticket waiting for you. Just go to the airport and go to Arizona with Luhana." And she moved to Arizona with Jacob. Her life took a turnaround.
In 2005, Tammy and Jacob came to live with me in Arizona. You know, I got to know my sister and got to have a really great relationship. Tammy went out with a girlfriend of hers. Stephen was there. They all got together, and I guess they just hit it off. He was an amazing man, and he was in the military, so he is a veteran. He called her on Valentine's Day, and he told her that he loved her, and she called me, and she was just like screaming in joy and happiness, and she said she hung up on him, and I said, well, do you love him? Yes, I love him. Well, did you tell him? Yes, I told him. It's just, I just remember that and hearing the excitement in her voice, because I have never heard her so happy, ever.
She said, I want you to come and meet him. And I said, okay. So I flew down, and he was so respectful of me. And he was just so nice and so kind. And Tammy just was madly in love with this guy, Stephen.
She called me and said, I want you to talk to somebody. And that's when she put Stephen on the phone, and we got introduced over the phone. You know, and I talked to him a little bit and told him what I was needing from him as far as taking care of my sister out there. And I was happy as long as she was happy. You know, I didn't know the fella at all, but I mean, all I did was hear good things about him.
Tammy got hired at Pure Clean due to the fact that Stephen worked there, and he'd worked there for years. They do restoration, fire, flood, and did a lot of cleanup from Hurricane Katrina.
First off, she liked working with Stephen. And second off, she liked doing things with her hands. She liked getting in and accomplishing and seeing what she did.
She was happy with what she was doing, you know, going down there and doing, you know, demoing all the damaged drywall and all that kind of stuff. And she really liked it.
If there was a disaster, she would go in and tear out walls or tear up floors so that the new beginning could start for the homeowners. She liked being able to help the people so that they could start their lives over.
She loved the physical work of that, and she loved being with Stephen. They had a great relationship even though they worked together all the time.
Tammy and I were very close. She would call me every morning. Hi, Mommy, I love you. I'm on my way to work, or, you know, I'm at work. I hope you have a good day. And, you know, she'd call me every day.
Some of the things I recall her saying about her coworkers and employer were not great. It wasn't an environment that she particularly liked, but she was with Stephen working, and they worked hard. William Miller was her boss at Pure Clean.
She'd call me every morning and she'd say, Mommy, I'm trying to work. Will you just tell William to leave me alone and stop picking on me?
It was kind of basically, if you want to get your paid, then you need help. Stephen committed arson with William on William's home. It was kind of basically, if you want to get your paid, then you need to help me, because I can get the insurance money and I'll give you guys your pay from Hurricane Katrina. And I totally know that Stephen would not have done that had it not been for being pressured.
Tammy Lovell had contacted the Scottsdale Police Department in late November of 2005. She did so after learning that Stephen had participated in this arson with William Miller. She had prior contact with Miller. She had worked with him or for him at the Puro Clean business, and she was very concerned for her boyfriend. So she reached out to the Scottsdale Police Department, and that initiated an arson investigation.
It was kind of a cat and mice game because Stephen was supposed to burn a bunch of stuff for the insurance, but they didn't. They put it in storage because Tammy was gonna get this taken care of. I don't believe she really confronted Stephen. She called the detectives on the arson case, and she dropped Stephen off at like Home Depot or something. And she went and she said, "I'll be right back." And she went and met the arson investigators, and then they approached Stephen. And that's how she did it. He cooperated with them because they knew he was in the military, and they said, you know the code. You need to, step up and do it, and he did.
On November 30th of 2005, Scottsdale investigators approached Stephen Duffy after being contacted by Tammy Lovell. During this investigation, they learned that Stephen Duffy and William Miller had poured gas within William Miller's residence in Scottsdale and burned the property.
So Tammy and Stephen became state witness, and they set up a phone call for Stephen and William on the phone, and Stephen couldn't get William to say anything. My sister might have been kind, but she was a very loud mouth. The boss, basically. And the police said, "Do you think you can get him to talk?"
So she said, I'm scared, but, I'm gonna do it.
She called William Miller, and a lot of things were said that, incriminated him. Then they arrested him on the arson charge.
On December 1st of 2005, William Miller was taken into custody by the Scottsdale Police Department. He was charged with several crimes, which included arson of an occupied structure, fraudulent schemes, and endangerment.
William Miller got out. Pure Clean must have had a lot of money. I don't know what his bail was set at, but he did get bail.
Tammy was just afraid what might happen, but, she had moved to a gated community in hopes that that would protect her and her children.
They were kind of in the middle, near the park area, and the houses were very close, like you shared a driveway with your neighbor. It was a 2-story house.
We talked about how when Stephen got his probation for doing the arson after he went to trial and things, that she was going to move to Utah so that she could be around me. And she said, I just need to wait until the state of Arizona talks to the state of Utah and they approve the transfer of his probation.
I did talk to my sister, and she would not go anywhere if she couldn't have a gun on her hip. Even she came to my house, she had a gun on her hip. She did not go anywhere without a gun. She said that she knew that her life was in danger.
Both Tammy and Stephen had an issue with William Miller, and they were fearful of William Miller. They had told several family members that they were keeping guns by their bedside, and they were carrying guns as they left their residence because they were concerned that William Miller might try to hurt them.
Gunshot, 5 shots next door, and then he heard screaming.
Neighbors had been the ones that called 911 that night. Neighbors had heard gunshots ring out and screams from the home and reported it to police in the early morning hours that night.
The officers responded to the scene. They attempted to make contact at the home, and no one answered. Since there was no contact from any of the residents in the home, a supervisor decided to call out the SWAT team. It took several hours, but they eventually made entry into the home sometime, I believe, after 5 a.m. I was called that morning, shortly after 6 a.m. by my supervisor.
I woke up and I got a phone call from the Mesa Police Department asking me if there was a baby living in my sister's home. And I said, my husband's a police officer, so why don't you tell me what you're asking me? That morning, Stephen Duffy, Tammy Lovell, Cassandra Lovell, Jacob Lovell, and Stephen's youngest brother, Shane, were all in the house.
I walked up a staircase, and I was immediately met with the body of Stephen Duffy. He had several gunshot wounds. I found Shane Duffy, Stephen's brother, lying on a bed. He had an obvious gunshot wound to his head. On the floor was Cassandra Lovell, and she had a gunshot wound as well. Within the southeast bedroom, as I opened the door, I saw Tammy Lovell on the floor. Within that room, I saw the body of Jacob Lovell. It was a horrific scene, one that I'll never forget. Here's Tammy protecting her little boy within that room. You know, here he is probably thinking his worst fears of the boogeyman, so to speak, being there. And that's the last thoughts he probably had before his death. This was unusual in that we had 5 deceased persons within the home. Obviously, in cases like this, sometimes you have a murder-suicide. It was difficult at first to assess if potentially there could be a weapon under one of the adults.
As information started to come out, we eventually learned this was a quintuple homicide. We learned that the entire family that had been residing in that home were killed. We really just didn't know. Is this a murder-suicide, or is there a killer on the loose? I mean, it was a very scary time for the community because we didn't know.
So I called her house, and I said, Tammy, Stephen, Cassie, Shane, what's going on over there? Why are the police calling me? And this went on all day.
I was at work, and Tammy hadn't called me that morning because that was so unusual. She called me every morning. So I tried calling her, and I didn't get an answer. So then Luhana called me, and she said, Mom, I can't get a hold of Tammy. And I said, well, that's funny because I can't get a hold of her either.
And I called my husband, hysterical. Well, actually, I called the Mesa Police Department. And I started screaming at them. My name's Luhana Chesley, and Tammy Lovell is my sister. I'm trying to get a hold of her, and I can't find her. I said, you tell me what's going on at this address. And she trying to placate me, and I got angry at her. And she told me that they had all been murdered. I find out my sister and her entire family are dead in that house.
Luhana called my roommate, and the roommate called me at work and said, Pat, you need to come home. And I said, what do you mean I need to come home? She said, you need to come home right away. I need to tell you something. And, you know, I just fell to the floor because I knew that something had happened. So I left work and I went home, and she said that Tammy had been murdered.
And so I called my husband. He's on his way home from work, and I'm screaming that my sister's dead, and he can't understand me because I'm just a hysterical mess. And then my husband finally got home. He said, we're going over there and do not talk to anyone. We're going to the command center, and you do not stop, and you stay with me. They took him into the command center while their lieutenant is outside talking to me, and he says, well, we really can't identify the people that were in the house. And that's one of the things that the lady on the phone said to me. And so I brought pictures of my nephew and my sister and my niece. I asked him if they suffered, and he said, no, they didn't suffer. And I said, any second that they heard someone else being killed, this is suffering to me.
Couldn't believe it at first. No. You're walking around, you're packing a bag like you're gonna leave right now. It was pretty tough.
I had never been inside a crime scene before with so many deceased persons. It was surreal to me to see 5 dead persons in close proximity to one another. It was evident that there were 2 different types of gun used. We found 40 caliber casings in addition to 22 caliber casings at the scene.
My job was to spend the day at the scene and gather information, interview neighbors, and talk to the police. The most sad and shocking details of this was that there was children killed in this crime. When I heard that a 10-year-old little boy had been killed, I just couldn't believe anyone would do such a thing.
Besides our unit, we had detectives from various other units within the police department conducting interviews, canvassing the neighborhood, doing intel on the parties involved. There was a ton of resources utilized in this particular case. As the crime scene in Mesa was being processed, I learned that there was a third weapon involved. Although there were no shell casings, ballistics examiners found that there was 9mm evidence at the crime scene. In other words, somebody had been using a 9mm revolver when they attempted and did kill Stephen, Tammy, and the children. We didn't see any motive such as a burglary or maybe a drug-related crime. It seemed very personal. One of the victims, by the name of Stephen Duffy, had been involved in an arson in late November of 2005. He had a co-defendant, and the co-defendant's name was William Miller.
Tammy Lovell was a witness in an arson case against her employer, William Miller.
We spoke to a number of family members of both the Duffy and Lovell family. I recall Colin Duffy, who is Stephen Duffy's brother, had mentioned William Miller's name to us as well. In addition, Tammy Lovell's sister showed up at the crime scene, and several other family members were contacted by other detectives. We realized William Miller could potentially have some connection to this, and we developed more intelligence on him. The more information we learned about Mr. Miller, it was evident that he was a strong investigative lead early on in this case. We sent detectives out to Scottsdale to start surveilling Mr. Miller. The difficult part was the logistics. Miller had committed an arson of his primary residence in Scottsdale, and he was living at a rental home at the time of this crime. In addition, he had a business location, so there were 3 separate locations that he would keep vehicles at and that he would move between during this time. So surveillance was difficult. Miller was also difficult to surveil in the sense that he was speeding through streets, through red lights, seemed very paranoid. Whether he picked up the surveillance detectives or not, I don't know, but his behavior exemplified that he perceived that he was being followed. During the course of this investigation, William Miller had made contact with several media members. There were cameras stationed outside of his home at times. Obviously, this also made it very difficult for surveillance teams. Several reporters from local newspapers were in daily contact with Mr. Miller.
Of course, we're reaching out to everyone we possibly can, and we reach out to William Miller. We didn't know if William Miller was a suspect. We just knew that he had a connection here.
The day after the murder, William Miller was at the Puro Clean Company. Miller reached out to the Phoenix Police Department on that date, which was February 22nd. It seemed that he was trying to say that his company or he himself was being harassed. Besides the fact that several of his employees had been murdered, now somebody was targeting him. Furthermore, Miller stated that his secretary had a gun stolen from her vehicle days prior. All this was unsolicited and seemed quite unusual. And we learned that she had, in fact, purchased a 9mm revolver on February 13th of 2006. This was 8 days prior to the murder at the Barrington Estates. Here's a person that is supposedly getting a gun for self-defense, but not carrying the gun itself on her person. So I felt that wasn't truthful. We spoke to the gun store employee. He said that there was a male present when this purchase was made. The employee was shown a photographic lineup, and he was able to pick William Miller out of that lineup as the person that accompanied his secretary on February 13th of 2006 when she purchased that revolver.
We're also hearing in the newsroom from another source, this person by the name of Richard Nixon. Their email address was Not So Deep Throat. He really fed us a lot of malicious information about the victims. I remember at that moment really questioning the motives of this Richard Nixon source because it was very clear to me that somebody was trying to throw us off. Some of us were sure Richard Nixon and William Miller were the same person, and others, including my editor, were sure they were different people.
I was notified by my supervisor that William Miller had reported a burglary to his residence in Scottsdale, Arizona. He had contacted the Scottsdale Police Department and stated that upon returning home, he had found that the home had been burglarized, entered, and that water from a kitchen fountain was left on, damaging the floors and surrounding area. Miller was under surveillance during that time. He was seen walking around the neighborhood, holding a flashlight. And at one point, Miller actually approached a surveillance vehicle that had a detective from the Mesa Police Department within it. And Miller went up to that vehicle and asked the officer if he was a cop. The officer said he had just been visiting the area. He was waiting for the people to wake up because it was late at night. This was probably about 3:30 a.m. Scottsdale detectives responded to the scene. Obviously, they were aware of the investigation that we had in Mesa 6 days prior. They served a search warrant upon William Miller's residence to obtain physical evidence therein. Some of the physical evidence that they located were projectile evidence in that bed where Miller said he had been purportedly sleeping when the shots were fired. And this physical evidence, ballistic evidence, was eventually compared to ballistic evidence at the crime scene in Mesa. The 9mm evidence at the crime scene compared with the 9mm evidence at Miller's purported burglary. So we knew we had the same gun being used in both instances. During the course of this investigation, I spoke to a number of Puro Clean employees. Some of these persons were not willing to speak.
You know, as a journalist, you're always trying to be objective. You don't want to jump to any conclusions. But I can tell you, everybody was very uncomfortable around him. I'm sure it was a total nightmare working for him.
Several of these employees eventually told us that they had been solicited by William Miller in the months prior to this murder, and they were asked to kill Stephen Duffy and Tammy Lovell. None of the employees went through with this. Some of them might have taken some money off Mr. Miller, knowing full well that they weren't going to do anything, but looked at it as an opportunity to make some extra cash. An employee told me that William Miller had used a grinder to cut up the revolver used in this murder, and Miller had dispersed pieces of this gun throughout the Paradise Valley Mall. The surveillance officer actually observed William Miller purchasing the grinder and apparently grinding the gun up. We were able to locate a piece of that gun within a water fountain at a food court area within the mall. The piece that we located was the largest piece, and it was subsequently examined, and they determined that it was consistent with that of a 9mm revolver.
We actually figured out that our source, our anonymous source, Richard Nixon, and William Miller were the same person. The two reporters who had been speaking with these individuals were able to compare a voicemail and made the connection that they were in fact the same person. And that was a really chilling moment for them.
In continuing to surveil Mr. Miller, we located an associate of his. This associate was asked to house sit at Miller's home the night of the murder. One of the most important things that the associate told us is that earlier that evening he had seen 2 firearms on the kitchen counter in Miller's residence. One of them he specifically identified as a .22 caliber pistol with a homemade silencer. At some point, Miller picked the .22 caliber weapon up and brought this associate out to his backyard. He fired 1 round in the backyard, and he told the associate, "Look, I can fire a weapon here in my backyard and nobody knows about it." And we subsequently served a search warrant on Miller's home that evening. We located 1 .22 caliber shell casing in his backyard. This shell casing was compared to the .22 caliber evidence we had at the crime scene, and we found a positive match. I learned that the .22 caliber evidence found at the crime scene and the .22 caliber evidence found at the Miller address were a match. At that point, we had probable cause to arrest him for this murder.
We learned that William Miller had been arrested out of a Scottsdale restaurant while dining with his wife. They'd enjoyed a lovely dinner, and then he came out the doors, and police were waiting to take him into custody.
I saw it on the news. I saw him on the news being arrested. I saw that.
I don't even know what I thought. I was just still stunned over what happened, so I definitely wanted to see him. You know, once we found out who it was, definitely would have liked to, had a chance to talk to him. They weren't gonna let that happen.
After police arrested William Miller, we finally realized we had a suspect. We could treat him as a suspect. And so we started to look more heavily into him and his background. You know, he was a business owner, a small franchise owner of Pura Clean, disaster restoration company. Ironically, did a lot of fire cleanups for a person who torched their own house.
My impression of William Miller, once he was brought into the police station, was he seemed very arrogant, cocky type personality, somebody that, I could easily see playing out this whole scenario. He has like the traits of a sociopath, and one of those is the narcissistic personality, so yeah, definitely a narcissist, all about him. I subsequently booked him that night on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The ballistic evidence that we had located in his backyard that linked up to the murder scene, and based on the statements of the associate that had observed Miller firing this weapon in his backyard, this was all really pertinent information that ultimately led to his arrest.
William Miller was trying to use the media to show that he was not involved. He was attempting to throw off the narrative and point to somebody else. This was a crime that shook and rocked the community of Mesa, and people came out to help. They donated funeral services. They donated money to the families. They really wanted to help and be involved in any way they could.
The memorial was amazing. I mean, so many people were there, and it was, and the preacher, they were coming to my sister's house, and they sat down and had meetings with us, and, made us really feel, good, and then they pulled off an amazing service. It was amazing.
Obviously, nothing can bring back the Lovell and Duffy family. It was a tragic, tragic event to have 5 people murdered in one home, in the sanctity of your home in the middle of the night. I mean, anyone's worst fears. The only thing we can do as a police department is attempt to do everything we can to bring the person responsible for a horrific crime like this to justice, and ultimately, that's what we did. The trial of William Miller, it took several weeks. Miller was convicted by a jury. The jury in Arizona decides whether someone is put to death or not. And in this case, they decided to put him to death. There was no remorse whatsoever that I observed or heard from William Miller throughout this whole process.
I was just so relieved that it was gonna be over. They found him guilty.
To find out he was sentenced to death, that was just so fitting. You know, you're just so angry, and to finally see justice served, it was a very good day for Arizona.
He's in one of the strongest prisons that there is, on death row, on isolation. You know, you can never hurt another family. So that's justice for me.
Everybody's healing in their own little way, stuff like that, but just don't talk about it a whole lot.
I would tell Tammy, Cassie, and Jacob if I saw them today that I love them. And I'm sorry that I couldn't have stopped what happened to them.
And Tammy, I love you and I miss you and those kids so much.
But families are forever, you know. We're gonna be together in the next life.